Live in 3, 2, 1. And we are live with Mr. Movement Debriefer, old school course reviewer, Z Mas Gigantico, Big Z, Zac Cupples himself. Zac, how the hell are you?
Well, I think you're hired for doing my intros from here on out. That was way better than what I do. Tim, I'm spectacular. I'm juiced up as all hell to be chatting with you again because we always end up having good conversations. So how are things your way?
I mean, I'm just going to put the offer out. Like, if you ever just need a hype man to introduce you at your courses or on other podcasts, I can just kind of travel with you and do that 5 to 10 second intro and then kind of hop out.
Well, if you're going to be a traditional hype man, I would want the intro, but then also too, like, so if you ever go to a rap concert, the hype man usually will emphasize like yeah. So it's like, so then we want to coach the stack, and then we would do that. That actually would probably be really cool.
Yeah, I think like more of a Little John style would suit my strengths, where you say something and then I just yell that word really loudly into a microphone, but at an infrequent enough interval to keep everybody on their toes.
Yeah, you know what? I think we're onto something because I think, and this is something that I think about when I'm presenting, is it really, I want to try to make it as much of a show as possible while still learning, because that keeps people engaged. So I think that would only get us closer to having that.
To use this as a springboard to a sort of real topic, I have noticed, like, with your YouTube content lately, you have like a nice beat going on in the background, and that's nice.
Yeah. Do you like that? Honestly, like, it's something I've been kind of experimenting with on and off.
Yeah, you put, and I'll put the link in the show notes, but you recently posted the video on arm bars, and I thought it was great, except for one of the beats had some like recurring vocals to it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But the beat itself, I really liked.
So no vocals.
Yeah, because you're the vocals, man. You're the show.
Yeah. Well, and part of that's probably because, like, with the hip hop that I really like, a lot of the older stuff. You remember, like, when Kanye was really starting out, he always had kind of the high pitched vocal in the background, and that was part of the instrumental. And like some of the another producer I really love, Jay Dilla, he would do similar things. So, but if it's distracting, I will make note of that, and when I get my beats in there.
I mean, who are you in the rehab and fitness space, if not the Kanye West of the rehab and fitness space?
Well, I hope that I'm more old Kanye than new Kanye. Yeah, just because, and I shouldn't rag on him too much because he does continue to innovate, and I do respect that. It's just I resonate more with his older music than his new. Conversely, like Eminem, who's my number one rapper, that man has continued to innovate throughout his career. And even though he's not as popular as he was in the beginning of his career, I think lyrically he is far surpassing his younger self.
Yeah, he can still lay it down.
Unbelievable. And just like, he rhymes way better in the pocket than he did very early in his career. Like, he stays on beat, he can mix it up. I mean, just, it's amazing. Like, you want to be like Eminem in your profession, whatever it is, and that's just continue to innovate, get better. And yeah.
I'm going to use this as a segue to get into a question I actually did want to ask you. And this was going to be towards the end of our time together, but you're pretty well known in the rehab and fitness space and the movement space. But if you didn't occupy that role, if you didn't do what you currently do, what other profession could you see yourself doing? How else could you see yourself spending your time?
Well, I think, and maybe this is one reason why I like production and content and things like that, is I kind of always had a little bit of a dream of being in Hollywood, like a Hollywood actor or a director of some sort. And this kind of helps fill that void, I guess, and it's funny because, like, I had that dream for a while as a kid, and then I never did any formal acting or anything like that. And then once I got into this, it just kind of like stoked that a bit. So I could definitely see something like that. The question is, would I be a starving artist or be someone who is somewhat respectful? Who knows? But if let's just say that's off the table, and I just had a more realistic job, I think I would probably either be something in finance, because that's something I've really grown to be interested in. I'm not sure what that would be, but I really like learning about that stuff. And if that didn't work, I would probably be either a postal worker or a UPS guy, because I always like the physical activity of that. Like, you mean to tell me I could deliver the mail, I could be walking and getting paid to walk, listen to tunes, podcasts, whatever. Sure. So that would be the tier of career arc if I could.
And might I just say from personal experience, no one rocks a pair of short brown shorts better than Zac Cupples.
Yes, indeed. It kind of reminds me of that one South Park episode where the UPS guy was continuing to get beat up by all the dads in town. That would probably be me.
Let's hope your fate would fare a little bit better than his. So what's up, man? So last time we spoke, that was March of 2021. I went down to Vegas and we were able to have a chat and hang out and elevate. So it's been
Indeed.
The better part of a year. What's new in your professional life? What's new in your learning? What are you most stoked about?
Well, let's go professionally first. So not much has changed actually on that front in terms of I still work at Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare, seeing patients there. And of course, still doing the thing at zaccouples.com. So I've been doing remote consultations, mentoring, training on that front. Have done a bunch of human matrix seminars since March of 2021. So that's been really cool to have that back in the mix, because I really did miss that. That's probably my favorite thing to do is teach. And I've been producing a lot of content, and I've just been, especially like the last few weeks, I've been really thinking about how I want that to be different than what it was. Just in terms of how can I reach more people to help more people on the movement side of things. So that's been really good. And in terms of what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis from a treatment perspective and things like that, looking back to what I did back then versus now, even though a lot of the principles are still the same, I think a lot of the methods are more refined and different. So, instead of, I'm utilizing a lot of other different things, such as various strategies to get people to just move with less tension overall. So that's where like a lot of rolling based stuff and things like that have been going. Like in the last month, I've been actually, it's funny because I think I was definitely delaying hinge based activities with quite a few people, but I've also been dealing a lot more with folks who I like to call the over tuckers or swayback based postures. And I've actually found doing things that are closer to a hinge have been really useful for that. And just using other different positions to help facilitate that. And I think the other thing that's probably changed is just thinking more about how can I continue to stoke these qualities under higher intensity activities. That's where like really looking at where I can throw this into plyometrics, throws, loaded based exercises, all of that. And then just continuing to refine the coaching and continuing to go slower and emphasizing different concepts on that, because I think, from what I've garnered with a lot of these concepts, especially teaching and just observing some of the people who attend my seminar and people who I work with, is I think it's very easy to go down a long rabbit hole of really fine tuning and designing a specific exercise to get a certain quality. But the problem is the ability to coach these things well is sorely lacking. And even just with like the simple concept of the stack, which for those of you who don't know what that is, that's like making sure they tuck well, making sure that we coach breathing in a specific manner that maximizes one's ability to move in the lower rib cage, and as well as the upper rib cage, not necessarily quiet breathing. A lot of people still struggle with that. And so really hammering the fundamentals on that front and continuing to slow down how I coach things, that all of that's been immensely useful. And there's some cases that, as I reflect back, that I had struggled with. And it's like, man, if I had just done things the way that I'm doing now, maybe it would be different. And I'm sure that's going to change 2 months from now as well. So, but those are kind of the things that I'm thinking about right now, at least on the movement side of things.
That you had a movement debrief about this, I want to say 2 or 3 months ago, like Swayback treatment strategies, management strategies.
Yeah.
And that's been such a game changer, because that's sort of, I feel like for years I kind of tried and failed to manage these folks with breathing interventions first, but then actually getting their pelvis to where it needs to be in space, doing something like I really like a bench supported hinge, or like some kind of a supported hinge, just so they can feel things actually getting long on the backside of their pelvis, has been such a fucking game changer, as opposed to trying to get them to like release tension places, like actually putting them in a position where their pelvis is no longer jutting forward in space. So it was, I credit you, because I think it was that debrief episode that actually gave me license to like really start experimenting with that stuff.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you found that useful, because I've also struggled with those folks as well. And, like rolling based activities and all that is also a very good starting point with them as well. But eventually you got to teach them to bring the pelvis back. And actually too, for that specific population as well, generally they are utilizing a more rectus abdominis dominant strategy. And so a lot of times when they tuck, you'll not only see them over tuck the pelvis, but then they'll also depress the sternum. And I'm actually going to be doing a video on this that's a bit relevant next week, where utilizing a lot more prone-based positions is really good. And so like prone on elbows, like a lot of like the classic, developmental DNS positions, I've been utilizing those more and messing with them. And they've actually been really good for that. So it's kind of, which is funny because I never used to use prone all that much, but it's like we use all these other developmental lower level based postures. Why not prone? And I think it's because a lot of times people have a tendency to extend through the back as opposed to reaching through the arms. But coaching that well has also been really helpful.
But Zac, if I lose my zone of apposition, won't I get diabetes?
Potentially. Yeah. You just got to be careful with that. But you have to look at what quality are you trying to drive, and is the way you're doing it getting that quality. And that could be of anything, like I can, if your goal is hypertrophy, you could do compound lifts to potentially get that, but then there's limitations to that at some point in time, and maybe machines are better. So I'm not opposed to any specific intervention as long as it pushes me towards the goal. Like I say this in my seminars, like if you can get someone their results by spreading peanut butter across their forehead and having a seance, then do that. Which, by the way, zaccouples.com/peanut butter. That's going to be the new product that we have for all your fat loss goals. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't think we need to be dogmatic about anything. Let's use what works.
Zac.com/seance butter.
Yes, the seance butter. Yeah. Gosh, that would be a great store. I thought about that. And then also selling beers that are like narrow and wide IPAs.
Oh my God, like 72 people would think that's hilarious.
Yeah. It wouldn't scale at all, but no, but it would be funny.
I love that you touched on something that I think has started to become a theme for season 2 of Michelle and I's podcast, which is this notion of learning to move with less tension. And I think it gets to the root of a lot of what we do as physical therapists. Like you could kind of argue that a big rock for probably how both you and I treat is trying to get people more into like a stacked alignment, right? Skull, thorax, pelvis. But then I think another huge piece that I didn't really fully realize until 6 months ago or 9 months ago is this movement dissociation and this restoration of relative motion. And again, I credit you and your daddy-o pops, Bill Hartman, for kind of popularizing this notion. But it just seems like a lot of really good things happen when we learn to dissociate segments of a body and restore degrees of freedom. So I just kind of wanted to tee up and let you riff on that.
Yeah, that has been an immensely helpful a piece for me as well. And yeah, I mean, and again, I got to give credit to Bill on that one, just because he's continuing to innovate that. It has been immensely useful because, when we're talking about movement of any kind, it implies that there's a gradient of some sort. So, movement occurs when things go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So like in the office right here, if I had a bunch of people in the office, there wouldn't be much movement unless I opened the door, and then people might go out to where there's less people, which would be in my living room. So but now the problem is a lot of the folks that at least I work with, I can't speak upon everyone, but they might have a situation where there is no available gradient. So this would be someone who's limited in multiple directions. And so then what do you do for that person? Well, if I'm limited in multiple directions, then that means that at rest, there is an increased amount of muscle activity for whatever reason. And we can't preface to the reasons why. There's like the genetic factors, epigenetic factors, et cetera, et cetera. But so if that's the case, then I need to utilize strategies that help reduce that tension overall. And then once you do that, it makes sense to then create tension in certain areas to then drive movement. And so doing that has been a really good starting point for a lot of folks. And that's not just on like the lower level rehab activities. I think reducing tension is also immensely important when you look at more high speed things like plyometrics or really any sport. You have to be able to relax enough to elicit the stretch shortening cycle and then produce force very quickly at one moment in time. And I work with a lot of golfers. And in order to have a really good golf swing, you have to have an incredibly fluid swing. Like you can't try as you might, you cannot force a really good golf swing. And the only way that you can have that fluid golf swing is to have very little tension into the backswing, produce just enough to elicit a good impact, and then your follow-through's got to be chilling like Bob Dylan. So, and we see that too with sprinting. Like why is it all the elite sprinters have cheeks that are flowing in the wind when you slow motion them? It's because they're able to produce.
We're talking face cheeks.
Yeah. Typically they don't show the back angle when they're running, so we can't testify if that's going on. But
that's why you got to go live, so you get that angle.
Exactly. Now that makes me wonder, if that when I ran, if people ever did that. But anyway,
YouTube.com/Zac Cupples track and field 2005.
Yes. I would go 07. I probably looked better at that year. So like even in that sport, or like heck, anyone who excels at anything, it oftentimes looks effortless. So if we can teach our supreme clientele and ourselves to move with less effort overall, I think that only has positive effects.
Yeah. And what I would add to that is my practice is in a CrossFit gym. So it's like, these are typically people in their 30s and 40s that have desk jobs, that have high training age, but that like to load heavily 5 or 6 days of the week. So I think like they're compounding whatever genetic and epigenetic factors they might be presented with, and kind of creating this perpetual high tension, high tone situation where then my job becomes really easy because all I have to do is convince them to do 5 to 10 minutes twice a day of activities to dissipate that tension, and they start to feel a lot better. I mean, I think, when you think of the typical powerlifter or CrossFitter going and running, it's like, you just kind of think of someone that's rapidly punching the ground over and over again, that can't really like roll through and create stride length. And when you were talking about that, a golf swing, like to me, that's the stride of a middle distance runner. Where it's like, if you watch a sprinter trying to accelerate over like a 40 meter, 60 meter stretch, there's not a lot of relative motions. There's not a lot of like elastic wind up. It's just kind of like bam, 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 bam. But like a truly efficient miler or like even like, 3K, 5K, it's like they're getting this maximum elastic recoil, and they need just the right amount of tension to be able to harness that. Too little and they just kind of like melt, and too much and they start to really stiffen up. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter if you're in pain and you want to get out of pain, if you just want to improve your athletic performance. I would go as far as to say, even with some of the lifting performance oriented things, you need to know exactly how much tension you ought to be producing, as opposed to everything is a 10 out of 10 tension at all times.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Every movement that we do has an eccentric component. And in order to maximize the eccentric quality of anything, you have to be able to minimize tension to some extent. And obviously that's going to change depending on the context. So, the power lifter, they need to minimize tension, but it's not as much as, say, the contortionist needs to minimize tension.
And I think that's just such a radical paradigm shift from what most people think about in the weight room, in the gym, is like, we want things to be tense and tight and like teeth gritting and trying really, really hard. I mean, I think back to, I've only recently started to program planks again for a lot of my people. And the reason I program planks is not maximal ab tension. It's to learn to titrate ab tension and still breathe and get sternal motion while there's some degree of ab tension. Cause that's like a second or third order skill at that point. Like, can we stabilize a thorax relative to a pelvis and get respiration versus just crunching everything and holding that sternum down, or even worse, like we get an inhale and the sternum goes further down.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and it's a concept that you can apply ad nauseum, and if you can get someone to understand what you're trying to go for, it really will simplify your coaching, because you're teaching the same thing over and over and over again. Hey, this that you're doing on the plank, I need that at your cable press, which I also need when you do a med ball throw, which I also need when you box.
Yeah, very well said. And I think this sort of gets us to one of the big biomechanical topics I wanted to discuss with you today. When we look at how a coach or a physical therapist can help an individual, like, in my opinion, there's three primary arrows in the quiver. We can improve systemic ranges of motion and mobility, and we usually assess these via table tests. I know you treat like that. I know I treat like that. We can do things to improve the motor control, coordination, and skill of an activity. So if they're a runner and they don't run well, we can teach them to run better. And then we can modulate the workload that an athlete is going under. So how much intensity, how much volume, how many minutes on the court, how many pounds lifted. Do you consider the movement piece to be the primary arrow in your quiver? And whether you do or not, speak to the interaction between those three things and how you approach trying to solve that matrix when you're trying to optimize an outcome for an individual.
I think just because I predominantly do physical therapy, that enhancing the amount of movement that someone has is definitely number one for me. But there's elements of all of that with everything, because sometimes you get someone moving differently, and then they go and do their normal activities, and because now they have more available movement, they might be loading things differently, and that can make other areas a bit cranky because they're not used to loading in that manner. So the interaction of all of these things, I don't think it's really hard to, I think it's very difficult to separate, in fact, damn near impossible, because in that example, even though the focus with someone was enhancing their available ranges of motion, well, we've altered the load management properties. Now, instead of having a continuous load over one area that maybe is contributing to that person's pain experience, well, now I have an acute load spike of now a broad area of being loaded. So I think there's a false dichotomy in movement, that these areas are separated, but the bias will change depending on who you're working with. Or like, for example, I train quite a few individuals as well, both in person and remotely. And I still will increase someone's movement availability and ranges of motion, but perhaps I'm not continuing to retest on the table, and maybe the KPIs are something that's more dynamic and standing. And I'm trying to select positions and activities that would complement what they need from a movement perspective. So let's say someone has a loss of shoulder internal rotation. That may mean that we do some activities to enhance their shoulder internal rotation, but then on when I choose loading based activities, perhaps the heavier loads, if I'm trying to increase force production, are not challenging ranges of motion that they don't have. So maybe that's doing some type of chin up and then doing maybe a decline bench press or whatever. I don't know. But then the accessories, which are a little bit less taxing, those are trying to work in ranges that would potentially improve someone's internal rotation. So maybe that's alternating horizontal presses. Maybe that's slight, higher incline presses, things of that nature. And then the load management piece, well, that's just making sure that you temper the amount of volume and intensity that you're giving someone. And, anytime you introduce something new, you need to start with small amounts and then increase that over time. So it really all blends together, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And there's definitely a degree of directionality between those buckets, right? The overall motion availability, the skill of movement, and then the workload. And I think it can flow in a lot of different directions. Like obviously a more skilled mover that can, let's say, better disperse forces over multiple joints is going to be able to tolerate more workload, even if ranges of motion weren't improved, like even if their table tests remain exactly the same. So I think it's interesting and liberating in the sense to be able to have all of these things in play, to have multiple different directions to get outcomes with your people.
Yeah. I think that as soon as you close off any one thing as potentially helping someone, you almost impose some self limitations in terms of your intervention capabilities. There's a lot of ways that we can get people better, and I think it would behoove you, if you work with people and you want to help people, to try to have more things at your disposal. It's just a matter of knowing when to use what.
And I also appreciate you bringing up the notion that when you're looking for a physiologic adaptation, like when you're looking for muscle building, power output, I think one of the big misconceptions about what both you and I do is, people see the videos that we make, people kind of see the things that we tend to put a little bit more detail into, and they tend to be more the movement oriented, like asymmetrical front back stance, breathing in a particular way. But those aren't the exercises that are particularly well suited to developing athleticism or power output or hypertrophy. So being able to have a good idea of when to include a more traditional weight room exercise, like let's say a goblet reverse lunge, and when we're going to go into something a little bit more movement oriented, like a front back staggered stance, like cable chop or something like that. And knowing that we're driving a movement adaptation with one and more of a power or hypertrophy or physiologic stimulus with the other.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. It's just the problem of the internet is there's no, you can't always give context to when you would use what. Even if you write out specifically what you would want to do, it's just, that person has to interpret what you're saying, just based on their biases, because there's no conversation of when certain things would be useful versus not. So, I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
And I know a big thing that Michelle is into these days is the notion that you can just take these big rock weight room exercises and tweak them slightly, and they become biomechanically far friendlier. So like she's into the slightly offset trap bar deadlift, mixed grip pull-ups, things like an alternating single arm dumbbell bench press, where we're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from something like a bench press or a deadlift. We're still getting 80 or 90% of the training effect, but without a lot of the deleterious biomechanical baggage that comes along. And I think that's a really interesting way to solve this problem. Like we still want positions where people feel stable and they can try hard, but maybe that won't rob us of so much external rotation or internal rotation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. And that's something that I've been utilizing a lot as well, because I think most of and again, I can only speak upon my population, but a lot of my population isn't looking to necessarily be weight room all-stars. They're looking to either get out of pain, or they're looking to train with less pain, or they're looking to look a little bit better physically, or they want to do different activities. Like again, at Elevate, we work with a lot of people who love golf, and getting huge and muscle bound, that tends to be counterproductive to that. So so for that person, having a massive bench isn't necessary. So you have to give people what's necessary for whatever their goals are. And then maybe, again, if I have someone who really wants to push either their strength gains, or they do want some type of body composition things, then I think that things like that are warranted. But then you want to try to do things to ensure that they can do that for long periods of time. And that's not pushing them in so far that we end up getting a significant drop off of movement, because that could potentially hinder them training wise at some point.
I suppose it's fair to say that your people at Elevate are interested in more train, less pain.
Indeed, they could be. They could be. Yes, that's a really good podcast name. We should probably really look into designing a podcast for that.
Yeah, yes, someone should.
Or two people who don't live in the same vicinity.
Do you have any thoughts on? So I think most people listening to this will be somewhat familiar with their work, with your work. If they're not, shame on them. We'll link to lots of it in the show notes. But the way that you typically operate, at least from a rehab standpoint, is testing some kind of a range of motion, giving an exercise, giving an activity, and then retesting a range of motion. Do you think that there could be an alternate shape to that? I don't want to call it transaction, to that entire situation, whereby a person might be able to circumnavigate such a structured activity, but still elicit beneficial movement changes. Like, I'm thinking back to, I just listened to our episode from March, and you talked about how one of your training and exercise loves at that point in time was spike ball. And I'm thinking, if you were to table test a person cold walking into the gym and then table test them 15 minutes into a spike ball game, might we see benefits that are comparable or maybe in some cases superior to more targeted respiration and position-based exercises?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't measured myself or someone before and after spike ball. I think anything can get someone better. It's just looking at the probability of specific things. Like, here's maybe an analogous example. Like, okay, let's say I could do spike ball as my sport. For those of you who don't know what spike ball is, well, shame on you. It's an amazing game, but it's basically like volleyball, like a 360-degree volleyball thing. Well, there's a lot of jumping or running around and change of direction that ought to occur with spike ball. But if I'm someone like me, who I try to grind the game down to a very slow halt by doing a bunch of crazy serves, well, then the chances of me achieving those physiological adaptations, just because maybe I'm not getting as good of the reps as I could, or here's another thing, like maybe you get really good at hitting and you don't have to move around as much because you know exactly where placement is. Well, the chances of me getting the movement adaptations that I want are probably less, or especially if I'm playing someone who's not as good as me. Conversely, let's say I play someone who's significantly better than me, I might be moving around a lot more. And so the chances of me consistently getting favorable adaptations of any kind are going to be variable. Conversely, when I do a structured program, the probability of me eliciting a specific adaptation is that much higher, because my intent is to try and get this. And I'm doing a specific amount of sets, reps, all of that to get it. And so I think really, like, gym-based stuff, rehab-based stuff, that's what it is. It's just a more targeted intervention, because when you start to apply these concepts to more open loop activities, you don't necessarily know the qualities that you're going to attain are just going to depend on the environmental factors. And you can apply that to any sport. And that doesn't mean that doing other sports couldn't get you into shape. I mean, heck, there's some people, like, when I worked in basketball, tell you what, there's a lot of people in really good shape basketball wise, who didn't lift a weight, and they were just absolute monsters. So, but if you're trying to target a certain adaptation, then you probably need to practice that. And that's just like anything, we could even extend that to learning music. You could try to freestyle a bunch of different things, but if you really want to learn a song, you probably need to practice the elements needed to perform that song.
Yeah. So we had a conversation with Joel Smith of Just Fly Sports Performance a couple episodes back, and we were just talking about this progression of exercises and training from the utmost structure and order to chaos, and kind of the need in order to structure a successful and very engaging training session to embrace elements of both the utmost order and the utmost chaos. And I think what he deals with primarily is a lot of younger athletes. Like, he's working with a lot of 13, 14, 15-year-olds. So obviously there needs to be a little bit more chaos. There needs to be a little bit more play. But I think that something that you and I talked about in our March episode was this notion that the goal is not to do as many resets as possible. The goal is not to do a reset as good as possible. The goal is to need as few of them as possible to be able to have a really, truly engaging training session. And it would just, and I think that was an excellent answer, because ultimately people are paying good money to see you and me because they want a very specific result and a very specific outcome. And it would probably be some form of malpractice to just have them play, have them juggle a soccer ball against the wall for 20 minutes and then recheck their ranges of motion. However, there's a part of me that would like to believe that a training program that was designed in such a way to elicit general movement variability qualities might get us some of these physical therapy outcomes, maybe without needing as structured of an intervention, or maybe it, might yield increased compliance with a home mobility program.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said wholeheartedly on that front. And, Tim, this is something I've just been thinking about a little bit as well. Maybe that even extends to training in and of itself. So, like, again, if your goal is to play spike ball really well, or hike a bunch, or rock climb, or whatever, the gym is only going to be able to get you so far with helping that, and as opposed to actually practicing the activity in question. So, I think you could also make an argument as well for training on that front isn't the end all be all as well. I remember I was listening to, I think it was Ben House, a friend of mine, and he said, I'm probably misquoting him, and you probably need to actually read the research, but in order to maintain the muscle mass that you have right now, you probably only need to train once a week. And then you could get improvements by training twice a week in terms of muscle mass. So then it just kind of made me think about, like, man, like, is really training even the end all be all? And for some it might be, for others it not. And I say that as someone who loves training. Like, I work out a few times a week, even though. So I started posting my I'm doing reels on Instagram, and I started posting like some of my workouts. And one of my friends, Rua, is like, I'm glad to see Zac back into training. It's like, bro, I've been training this whole time. Like, just because it's not on the internet doesn't mean I don't train. Obviously, I don't, I'm not like this specimen of a human being either, but it's just funny. So, but yeah, I mean, it's like, I enjoy training, but for what I want to do physically, I don't necessarily need to be doing 5-3-1 bench squat deadlift.
Yeah. And I think that this is why, for all the clients that I manage, that I do remote programming for, I really like for them to have a thing outside of the gym, and typically outside of running as well, that they can immerse themselves into, that puts them in their body, that gives them another reason to train. Because I think if a person takes up ultimate frisbee or climbing or skiing or a combative or dance, it lets them start to see the physical experience as far more than just, this is my bench, this is my deadlift, this is my squat, or even like in our domains, these are my isolated ranges of motion. Like if we really know that we're going to be doing a wholly immersive activity that's going to require a little bit of strength, a little bit of power, a little bit of endurance, then we can start to have these gym sessions that look very interesting and aren't driving towards this, like, oftentimes very egocentric goal of like, I just want to be, I want to know what it feels like to deadlift 405 pounds.
Yeah. I love that. So on that front, are there specific, like, if you got someone who's maybe doesn't have one of those things, how do you cultivate them finding an activity like that? I'm just curious, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about for people.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this started with you and I talked a little bit before we started recording how I used to work a lot of home health, and balance is like the big issue with older adults and reducing
Mhm.
falls risk. And when I started, the first year was like a lot of isolative, like, okay, you're gonna get into this front back staggered stance, and we're gonna push you around a little bit. You're gonna step into it, step out of it, like very structured, kind of what we would see in the gym kind of exercises. And then the more I did it, the more I realized like this is essentially some kind of a Tai Chi derivation, maybe even like a ballroom dancing kind of thing. So it kind of
Mhm.
morphed into just now I'm doing ballroom dancing with a 82-year-old woman in her living room. And then when it got time to discharge, the higher functioning ones, I started recommending, hey, like go out into your community, see if you can find something that's like this, find something that's structured, that's social, that's engaging, that's fun, because that's going to get you even better than we currently have you, which arguably is like the best that you've been in 3 years or 5 years. But I do think, and I'm no longer in that realm these days, but I think there are certain activities that lend themselves pretty well to a beginner, especially as an adult. Like it's not the easiest thing in the world to pick up gymnastics as like a 35-year-old. But I think I'm in Colorado, like rock climbing is a really, really big thing. You're in Vegas, huge climbing scene. I think, bouldering, top rope climbing are two really, really easy ways for a person to experience multiplanar movement, for a person to learn to problem solve with their body, to kind of like learn a little bit more of where their limbs are in space. Like I think that could be tremendously impactful and not as intimidating as like joining a pickup basketball or soccer or ultimate frisbee team or something.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think the one thing that you've mentioned with all of that is there's with all of those activities, there's a social component. And especially now with us being glued to our phones and, the impending metaverse coming our way, that is going to be such a rare thing that I think we will be experiencing. Whereas like being in the gym, even though sometimes you can, and maybe that's one benefit of CrossFit is there's at least a social component with it. And at Elevate, we have semi-private options that we call custom training, or group classes where there's a little bit more of that social element as well. But when you're training by yourself, it's very you focus, which you need some of that. But if everything you do is you focused, especially I think nowadays remote work is much more prevalent. You need to have somewhat of a social outlet as well. And if you combine that with movement, I think the health benefits will far transcend anything that we could accomplish with a training program in the gym.
Yeah, and I think back to a period of my life recently that actually you were working with me during, so I give you some credit for this. But when I lived in Boston, I was running with a sub elite track club. Like, that was probably the most consistent running training that I had experienced in my life, which is saying a lot because I was in my late 20s then. I was like 7 or 8 years removed from being a collegiate athlete. And I think one of the big things there was I was only training with a team 2 days a week. So that let me actually give my body what it needed the other 5 days, which was a couple of days of rest and these more restorative, like Michelle was handling my programming, you were handling my rehab. Things were going really, really well because I think a certain type of person, when they train with people every day, is going to train 120% and not modulate well and just kind of blow through discomfort into overt pain and injury. And I think a certain type of person, when they train with people, maybe isn't just going to do what's in their best interest. Maybe they're just there for the social aspect and they're not actually putting any work in. So I think there's tremendous benefit to having regular training experiences by yourself as well as with a group. And maybe like we were talking about before, that's not even training. That's just you go play ultimate frisbee on Saturday mornings.
Hell, that's probably life, Tim. Gosh, I forget what the one quote is about the person who can't spend 30 minutes by themselves in a room. God, you know what I'm talking about, though, yeah.
No, I know the whole like if you don't have 5 minutes to devote to meditation, then you need 30. Like that's the
Yeah. But there's benefits of being comfortable being by yourself and alone, and also, but there's also we're inherently social creatures, and so I would agree with that. That's probably a larger principle concept that applies to many different things, not just movement. And so I would echo what you say, to have all of those things within a well-structured life would be immensely beneficial.
Any closing thoughts on so this concept of like chaos versus order? Because it seems like from this conversation, you would probably be on the end of if you're going to be in the gym and you're probably only in the gym for like a day or two a week, most people, we probably want to structure those sessions to maximize efficacy of time spent in the gym. So very, very ordered so that then we can go do our chaos outside the gym, as opposed to trying to infuse 10 minutes of juggling a soccer ball in the middle of a deadlift workout.
Yeah. Unless you don't have chaotic elements outside, then perhaps you could do that. Like for example, me personally, I don't get consistent chaos. So like one of my power-based days is I will play wall ball with myself. So I'll just like hit a ball up against the wall and I'll try and go and get it somewhere. And so that's some element of how I get that. So I think you can, you structure your training based on what you're not getting outside of that. And yeah, so I think you could use both, but I think the ideal would be to have structure when you are doing structured training, just because the loop is generally more closed, and then have something else be more the chaos open loop.
I just imagine a prospective client walking into Elevate, getting the tour, and they're like, what's that guy over there doing in the corner? Oh, that's Zac. He's just playing wall ball by himself 30 minutes over lunch every day.
That actually has happened. I was doing wall ball at night, and Coach Francis, Francis, he was giving someone a tour, and I kind of did you ever see the movie Above the Rim?
No.
Oh my God! Well, it's a great movie. It's like a '90s basketball, because that's when like all the basketball movies came out, and there was this guy. He kept like replaying this one-on-one game that he played with someone, but without a basketball, and it was just him. And so he'd be like, so I kind of envision that that's what it would be for me if someone sees me playing wall ball.
Oh boy. Or that's Zac. He's just rolling on the ground. Don't mind him.
Yeah, that's also been a true story. People always make comments about me rolling around and doing my ninja skills.
Oh boy. No, but I think I think that makes a certain amount of sense. Like we had David Gray on for one of the early episodes this season, and he was talking about something he really likes doing, like after a particularly arduous strength training session for his clients, is to just like kick around a soccer ball or shoot around a basketball. And I think that meshes really well with what you and I were talking about before, this need to unlock degrees of freedom. Because I think no matter how well you execute something like a trap bar deadlift, if the weight's heavy enough, that's not going to be a movement restorative type of exercise. That's very much going to be a power exercise, a muscle building exercise, a minimization of degrees of freedom. So I think where I was kind of trying to lead us to with the question about resets and play versus structure is there seems like there could be an angle of, okay, yeah, like just go do wall ball, go do Zac wall ball by himself, just to make the last thing of the training session not this incredibly high tension, incredibly blocking together, minimization of movement options sort of thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You just have to ensure that the activity is one that elicits that goal. Like, for example, let's say you're kicking a soccer ball around as your cool down. Well, if you have someone who has no concept of, they've never kicked a soccer ball in their life, that's probably not going to elicit the adaptation you want. Because anytime you're learning something new, and this is demonstrated in the research, but the amount of movement variability that's performed at that task is at least coordinative. So the variability you would get within the task is significantly reduced, but the outcome is varied. So you would just have to make sure that the activity is familiar enough that you do get that specific adaptation.
Yeah, it'd be interesting, right? It's like familiar enough that we can kind of be fairly confident about what the effect is going to be, and yet not so familiar that your body just kind of gloms onto it, and it's not novel, it's not salient, it's just going through the motions.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you think is the most low-hanging piece of like either mobility, knowledge, or strategy that most athletes in the gym could be using for the improvement of movement that they miss? Like what is what is like the one thing that might yield 60, 70, 80% of movement improvement?
Well, if you're an athlete, that likely means you're producing forces at high amounts and at high speeds. So anything that contrasts that, which would be low amounts of muscle activity at slower speeds, is probably a good thing. And so finding a way to perform something like that could be very useful. And so that's where like I use a lot of rolling based activities. I really want to spend a bit more time learning like Feldenkrais stuff. You had mentioned Tai Chi. That's another example of that. Just moving slow to provide that contrast, I think, would probably be something that doesn't necessarily require a significant amount of coaching, but could yield a lot of benefits. I think is something that I've been using a lot more. I'll use that when I'm programming for some of my clients. I'll use that as the cool downs. On off days, you do those types of things. So I think that's probably where I would push people towards.
What I would add to that too is and you and I have talked about this, I know a bunch, but I think this is where isometrics can be incredibly impactful as well. Like get a person into a position and then the repetition is just breaths as they're finding and feeling that position. If we're looking to contrast, like let's say a runner, a sprinter, a court athlete, that's never really going to be feeling too much of anything.
Yeah. I would agree with that as well. Yeah. And both of those are eliciting different interoceptive senses within you. One is feeling nothing in terms of like less activity, and one is feeling a very specific activity. Is the difference between like a walking meditation versus a focused meditation. One, I'm focusing on one thing, and then the other is it's more of a broad spectrum of things.
I was trying to think about how I would answer that question kind of when I asked it, and what would your thought be? Just because I think the longer we do this, the more we can see the forest through the trees. And it seems like a lot of things lately have just caused me to reflect on like what we're really trying to do with the improvement of movement variability. A lot of times is enabling a person to get expansion in areas of their thorax or areas of their pelvis where they didn't have that before. So it kind of seems like the holy grail of easy movement restoration is getting a person to feel like, oh, okay, now my sternum moves with an inhale. Now my back expands with an inhale.
Yeah. And I think that extends even beyond just the thorax, so that extends everywhere. You generally your body is craving the most efficient strategy ever, right? So that's why why run when you can walk? Why walk when you can stand? Why stand when you can sit, et cetera, et cetera. And having less movement is generally more efficient. So we want to try to do things that enhance movement or range of motion, or even on like a more global perspective, increase space everywhere, because the more space we have, the more available movement we have. So that extends to even something as simple as my elbow joint. Well, if I can't move my elbow in all directions, then I have reduced space there, and I want to try to do things to increase space. And to me, that's being able to maximize the amount of space you can create within your body, and then being able to manage it under inherent stressors of any kind, whether that's a physical stressor or anything. I think that's really the holy grail of what we're trying to achieve from a movement perspective. And not only that, but I think that concept probably extends well beyond movement. We want to have increased space and diversity of thought, and be able to withhold our what our thoughts are under different stressors. That's even true within like something like finances. I want to increase the amount of financial space I have money, and I diversify my money in the sense that if there is a stressor of like, I don't know, a pandemic or a stock market crash, that I'm still doing well. So it's kind of like a first principle that I think applies to many different domains.
This is why you've converted 100% of your assets to Dogecoin, correct?
I'm actually trying to go Floki Inu because that one hasn't popped yet, but I think it will. It's funny. One of my clients, he's like, if you have enough money for food, then you're not all in on crypto. And I do think about this.
No, but I think there's so much to that, right? Like I think in a really pared down sense, all we're trying to do from a movement perspective is to create expansion where we don't have any, and then to teach relative motion so that we can utilize those newly created areas of expansion. I definitely like the generalizability to finance and life, but I think like one of the questions I was going to ask you, which I warned you was kind of unfair, was to describe your biomechanical treatment model or training model in 3 or 4 sentences. I think we might have just done it in like 4 words with expansion and relative motion.
Yeah. Well, so here it is. Increase space, which implies there's relative motion between the bones, and then be able to manage that space under duress. That's basically what I do. And yeah, that's basically it.
Where do you find that people's big misconceptions about that strategy tend to lie? Like let's say, physical therapists that you mentor.
Well, I think the people who come and want to learn from me have an idea of that's what they want to achieve. I think the overall misconception is people think I only need to do one and not the other. And so you have people on one end, and I do run into this sometimes as well, especially with people who I help on the movement side of things, is, well, I can't do this stressful activity until I have all of my passive movement available. And maybe they have a sense within their bodies that their bodies are a bit more fragile, which, to be fair, some of these folks, when you have a system that's very chaotic, that can be. Like, I have a gentleman who I work with right now where I introduce an activity and his whole body goes crazy, like pain here and there, everywhere. And then after a while, he eventually gets it. And those people do exist, and we can't brush them aside because they need just as much help, if not more, as someone else. Conversely, there's other people who think that, well, I just need to get stronger and manage load and produce more force, and that's all that you need. And well, that also has its limits as well, because we don't know what you're going to look like 10, 20 years down the line. Look at the health of Ronnie Coleman right now. Like, it's not good. So I think being able to have the best of both worlds is really the key. And none of this has to be, I think, and this is probably just the internet in general, or just the way the world is right now, is it's always either or conversations. Whereas to I think really have progress in any domain, you need to have both and conversations. Is how can I maximize both of these so we can hit whatever it is the end game goal is for those people. So you want to try to maximize your ability to utilize things in many domains, as opposed to just siloing yourself into one.
I think there's a big problem in both the fields of fitness and rehab with people getting incredibly defensive with whatever the first thing that they learned or they were exposed to was. And I think you said it beautifully. Like, we need to be having these, what did you turn it? Not either or, but
both and.
Yeah. Like how can this be true and this earlier thing that I was utilizing be true? Because that starts to really let us widen the lens that we have available to view movement problems, human problems, and help people in a way that's really going to stick long term.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly, because ultimately most people need both to some extent. You need to have enough range of motion that you can stay healthy, and then you need to be able to produce enough force to be able to withstand physiological stressors. And that could be force of any kind, that could be endurance, whatever it is that you need.
Yeah, I think there's some really cool things, back when you and I were in physical therapy school, like the early aughts, that's kind of when PRI was just coming on the scene. And it's kind of interesting, like 5 or 10 years later, now a lot of people that were in that space early have taken that information and kind of come through the other end, and now started to layer like really stressful barbell bilateral training on top of that information, and trying to create an organism that can kind of handle like these very, very high training loads while respecting some of the principles that PRI exposed you and me to. And I think that's a great example of like, instead of living in this land of we need to wait till table tests are perfect, we can maintain that viewpoint as we now layer on the old school Eric Cressy, Mike Boyle, Tony Gentlecore type of shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And, all of those things work to some extent, but it just depends on what the goal is of each of those, right? No one system or model has all the answers. And that includes the systems that you and I both utilize right now, because I'm certain that there are many things that we don't know or are aware of.
And I think probably assuming that 25 to 50% of what we currently do is incorrect has always, I could see how that might be destabilizing to some trainers and some clinicians. But I think adding that layer of humility and really trying to constantly question why it is, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you do what you do? And constantly refining things, like that's how we layer by layer just get a little bit less wrong as time goes on.
Yeah, that's why it's practice. Because you gotta continue to get better. And I think because there's so much that we don't know, and again, this is a broad concept of there's just a lot that we don't know about reality in general, right? That will never have the right answer. It's if you're in science, you're always looking for the least wrong answer.
I know, my friend, that you were a busy man, and we got to get you back to the studio to making some beats. There's a few more topics I wanted to discuss with you. So what I'm proposing is a lightning round where you will get 60 seconds to give as thoughtful and complete of an answer as you can within the allotted time. How's that sound?
Let's get it.
All right. Let's pick a good one here. You are well known to the people that know you as a big hiker and a fan of national parks. National park and or hike that you are most excited to go on within the next calendar year.
Well, I'm going to be going to Yosemite with some friends for Christmas, so I'm excited for that one in the immediate. I'm hoping this summer I can hit up either Yellowstone or Yellowstone Grand Teton or Glacier. I was going to do that last year, but it was stupid expensive, so I didn't do that. But I definitely would like to hit something that I haven't done yet, because I've done Yellowstone. I've done many on the West Coast.
You got to come to Rocky Mountain National Park, by the way.
That's also on my list. Colorado has so many good national parks. And I'm trying to think. I don't think I've done any of them. Yeah, I need to.
Yeah, definitely come out. You can hang out with me and Aileen.
Oh, that'd be great. I would love that.
The vision for the Zac Cupples brand circa 2027.
That's a good one, man. I have a list of things that I'm looking to do, but my hope is to eventually condense the number of people who I work with, and offer a really high quality product. And I want to try to automate as many different things as I possibly can so I can just help more people, because there's only 24 hours in the day and I'm only good for so many. But there's a lot of people who need help. So trying to find ways that I can automate what I offer is going to be on the forefront. And so that's kind of where I'm hoping to be. I really enjoy education and teaching. And so I really want to try to cultivate as much of that as I possibly can. And it seems that a lot of the fam benefit from that. So if I can continue to get better at that, I will.
Yeah, I mean, the teaching stuff is certainly, in my opinion, the way that you've impacted the most people. Like, I think it's the reason why a lot of people that do what we do know who you are and are, asking better questions about the way that a lot of exercises are performed or conventional physical therapy recommendations. So I think in that regard, you've already been incredibly successful.
Well, I appreciate that. That's very humbling, but can always be better too. So.
Biggest problem with the state of physical therapy and the healthcare system currently?
That's a tough one. Well, my bias is outpatient orthopedics. I think just because of the way things are going with insurance and things like that, it's there's a lot of places that are becoming much more high volume. And when you have high volume, you can't offer as good of quality. So I see that as a big problem. And it's kind of this vicious cycle of, that I do high volume, so I can't offer as good a care. And then research is done on the efficacy of physical therapy, and it shows that it's less effective. And so then now doctors are recommending, I only want you to see a PT for one visit to give a home exercise program. And then the saga continues because, well, now reimbursement declines. So then I have to see more people, so on and so forth. So that's, well, it's not concerning for me because I fortunately been able to get out of that loop, but it does concern me for a lot of the people coming into the profession, because you need reps to be able to get out of that loop. But if the reps are very low quality, then that's really tough. So, I hope that the profession can find a way to circumnavigate that problem, but it's going to be a very tough problem to overcome.
That's why you got to break the wheel. People that are listening, go cash based. Set your own rates, be in charge of your own destiny.
Absolutely. And that goes into making sure you set yourself up very early on so you can do that and take that risk. And that would be not going to a really expensive PT school, minimizing your debt. And, maybe, and this is something that I think you did that was really, really intelligent, was you practiced home health, which what nice about home health, you get one-on-one time. So that allows you to have better experiences, but then also makes more money. And that's, one reason why I did travel PT for a lot of my careers, because I wanted to get out of debt. But also the nice thing about travel PT is I was able to select places where I could work one-on-one, because I've been very fortunate that I've never had to be in a mill. I've always tried to select one-on-one based places. And the only time I ever saw people twice, 2-on-1, was there was a couple times with Bill when I was interning with him that I did. And then my residency, there was one clinic where I did that, but I would much rather see people one-on-one. And I've tried to keep it that way throughout my career, but that's going to be a lot harder to do as time goes on.
Yeah. You and me both, man. We both been so spoiled by that. And I mean, that's not luck. We've kind of designed our early careers to go in that direction. It's just a shame. Like I think a lot of really well-meaning future clinicians are going through programs now, and they're inevitably going to be the ones that are populating these mills and making them work, and potentially, I don't know, having the whole field go in a not so desirable direction. However, like you said, what that does do is it massively opens the door for people that are willing to deliver a higher quality, 50-minute, 1 hour, one-on-one service where we can like deeply tackle these problems in a way that in a conventional physical therapy practice, would be unheard of.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that.
Best strategy for making behavior change stick with a client that isn't good with doing their mobility homework.
You need to find the minimal effective dose for whatever they're willing to do, and have a conversation with them about what's realistic and reasonable, and then you just adjust accordingly. So, and one question I will generally ask someone, I got this, I think, from Tim Ferriss, is, hey, I would like you to do this X number of times, X number of times per day. Does that seem reasonable? Very rarely will someone tell you that you're unreasonable. So I think that's been very useful for getting people to establish behavior change. But I will also say this too, and this is the bias that I have, is generally, since I've gone fully cash pay now at this point, that seems to be less of a problem, I think, because when someone goes cash pay and they're throwing they're having more skin in the game, they're going to follow through on the recommendations. But when I was in insurance, and that was less of a thing, I tried to make the commitment very small in the beginning, and then eventually you increase the commitment over time, because over time you want people to be more physically active. And in those populations that I worked with, that was, hey, I'd love you to start walking regularly because you don't move.
And I'll add another Tim Ferriss quote to that, which is something I think about quite a lot with this type of client, which is, what would this look like if it were easy?
Mm-hmm.
I'll lay out the program for them. I'll ask them that question, and based on their answer, we can then make some modifications. And I love what you said, hey, can you give me 5 minutes once a day? And can we use that as a starting point? I mean, hell, for a lot of people, maybe 5 minutes once a day is enough of a dose to get the movement changes that we need. But at least we can start. The other thing that I would add there too, which is a weird hack that I'm really not sure why it works. Michelle and I have talked about this a bunch, but actually printing out their program and giving it to them on a piece of paper and having little check boxes that they can put in. I've talked about this with Aileen too. There's something about having that actual, like something that exists in the real world that you can check. That's deeply satisfying. Like I think back to when you and I were in our running heyday, like you probably kept a mileage log, and it was very, very satisfying to see those miles tally up.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. That's something I did when I was in my insurance gig, because I had like my own little exercise manual that I made. So I'd print them out and do that. But that's actually a good idea. I should probably go back to that somehow.
And finally, 2 questions that came through Instagram. One is Merle Hammond, and he asks, what advice do you have to simplify treatment for young clinicians?
To simplify treatment for clinicians, I would focus on getting your people to get really good at one thing and slowing down your coaching. Because especially with a lot of the stuff that we do, these exercises can seem very advanced. There's a lot of moving parts, so on and so forth. And on the internet, I show you all the parts. But when I'm coaching someone through that, I might focus on only 1 or 2 parts. And so you got to get really good at coaching those 1 or 2 parts. And so if we're talking about a stacking based activity, can you get your supreme clientele to be bad mother tuckers? So really hammering that before you throw in some other stuff. I think that's probably the most important thing that you can do, because it's very easy to overcoach someone.
I would add that's probably the biggest mistake I see with, like, I do a bit of mentorship as well. And I think clinicians, especially in that 0 to 2 years out from PT school, that are really, really excited to show everything that they know. And typically, like, the people that are seeking me and you out are kind of the clinicians that are in it for the right reasons. Like, they're really curious, they're constantly learning, but a lot of times that over exuberance can actually be deleterious with, like, the overall client experience.
Yes. Because the fancy stuff is not going to be needed by the vast majority of people. But you do need to know some of that fancy stuff, because as you get better at your craft, you get more well-known in your area, you're going to start seeing the outliers more. But even the outliers need to have the fundamentals down first before you get fancy.
And finally, our mutual friend Ranak over in India asks, how is fascia related to pain? Is this something that you consider when designing treatment strategies?
So, I will admit I haven't studied as much fascial-based concepts as some other people in the industry. But my thought is there's going to be a limitation to explanatory power as well as intervention when you try to isolate any specific tissue, because you can't isolate any specific tissues. So it likely does have somewhat of a role, but it's insofar as that person's system operates and performs specific movements. If someone's doing a fascially based intervention, well, they can't separate the skin from their intervention. And you can't separate muscle, and you're moving bones, and you're moving a lot of stuff. So I think breaking things down into isolated things helps from a learning perspective and is necessary. But we have to realize that we're dealing with a complex system where you have all of these things interacting together at once to elicit certain behaviors, with pain or outputs, with pain being a behavior and output of many that could potentially be occurring.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And, even stuff like exercises that we thought were predominantly muscular in their aims, I think the more we learn, the more we realize, like, connective tissue has a big role, bones have a big role. in like energy storage and deformation, and things that we once thought as targeted really do have these more wide ranging effects in terms of position, in terms of adaptation. I mean, there's a reason that a power lifter's skeleton, if you were to strip away all the muscle and all the like fat mass, looks different than a normal person's skeleton. Like there's actual adaptation going on at the skeletal level. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's a book out there called The Spinal Engine, which is a really cool book, where they talk about like the number of newtons that like one part of the erector spinae can produce is like 200. And I'm bastardizing the numbers specifically, so take that into consideration. But like in order to deadlift something very heavy, you're producing like 15,000 newtons of force. And so we have a little bit of a mismatch in terms of the amounts, clearly. So how is it that we can lift weight still? And well, that's because the fascial system and all of the other systems interact together to be able to complete that task. And so it is important, and it's all the systems are important. And you can't, anytime you focus too much on one, you neglect the others, you're likely missing out on some important information.
Very well said, good sir. I think we are running up on time here. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with the people?
Yeah. Just if I think overall, if we can be open-minded to many different things with a healthy dose of skepticism, and we never rule out things that could potentially help our clients and stay client first, then we're only going to do good things. So keep on keeping on, fam.
How do people learn more about you, and how would they work with you?
Well, the place to be is zaccupples.com. That's ZACCUPPLES.com. That's where that's kind of the hub for all of my content on YouTube, social media, things of that nature. And that's where you can sign up for any services that you want to work with me, whether it's movement consultations, which would help with the increased space side of things, training, which is going to help with pushing physiological qualities while still respecting your movement goals, or mentoring. I also offer my seminar, Human Matrix, which we got a few of those coming up next year. I actually might be in Denver. I'm still working on that. Yeah, so that'll be fun. And otherwise I'm across all social media platforms, YouTube, if you search Zac Cupples. And then I actually just started, I'm going to kind of silo my channels a bit. There's the Zac Cupples exercise clips channel. That's a new one that's going to be up there, as opposed to throwing all my exercises on my main YouTube. So that's going to be there. And then in terms of social, if you go to that Instagram, baby, it's Zac, ZAC, Cupples, CUPPLES, and Twitter and Facebook are Z Cupples. So check me out there.
I mean, I always find it very entertaining that Keanu Reeves actually has to pay you royalties every time that he uses the word matrix, because you went ahead and copywrote that way back in like 97, 98. I think you had just incredible foresight.
Yes, absolutely. And not only that, but when I eventually have Human Matrix Reloaded Revolutions, and then 20 years later, I have Human Matrix Resurrections, I'll really be getting those royalty checks.
I mean, 20 years from now, you are going to have the jaw expansion of a Greek god.
That's the hope. We'll see. I mean, even though going through what I've gone through right now has been very helpful, I'm really tired of having braces. And hopefully I won't have to do anything else for a while. But who knows what's going to be available then and where my health's going to be. So
stay tuned.
Stay tuned indeed.
Mr. Zac Cupples, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with me on this fine day.
Tim, it is a pleasure as always. I could do these weekly if we had the time. So you're an amazing human being. Keep being awesome.
Right back at you. Thanks again, man.